Prije 1400 godina skromni trgovac koji nije znao ni čitati ni pisati promijenio je lice Arabije. Zvao se Muhammed. Njegov utjecaj do danas je stigao do svakog dijela planete, uključujući Sjedinjene Američke Države. Ovo je priča o njemu i milionima Amerikanaca koji vjeruju da je on posljednji Božji poslanik. Nije bio ni visok i vitak, niti nizak i zdepast. Kad bi neko gledao, gledao bi ga ravno u oči. Bio je najljubazniji od ljudi, najiskreniji u govoru, najblaže naravi i najplemenitijeg roda. Svi koji su ga opisivali govorili su: ni prije njega, ni nakon njega nikad nisam vidio nekog sličnog. Ovako Muhammed a.s. opisuju danas.
Muhammad was a man who faced an absolutely hopeless situation. There was a whole continent virtually of people killing one another in an endless, hopeless vendetta, going down a chute of violence and warfare, feeling that society was coming to an end and had no hope. He gave them hope single-handedly. In a space of 23 years, he brought peace and new hope to Arabia and a new beacon for the world.
Islam, religija koju je Muhammed a.s. počeo širiti u Arabiji, danas broji 1,2 milijarde sljedbenika širom svijeta. Procjenjuje se da u Americi živi 7 miliona muslimana. To je najbrže rastuća religija u Americi s najraznolikijim sljedbenicima.
Like America itself, the Muslims in this country come from all over the world. They have a common bond, not only in their religious faith and in their mosques, but in this story of Muhammad. They all look to it. This is the source of how to behave, of how to be a constructive citizen, of how to be a good parent, of how to be a good child, of how to seek knowledge and truth. These are values that are expressed most clearly for Muslims in the story of Muhammad.
In the Quran, Allah says that Muhammad is the best example of behavior for you. And that's what he is, the guide for the way we deal with each other, and when we're in a position of authority, how we attempt to implement justice and law.
The Prophet Muhammad, he asked the question to people around him: do you love your Creator? Serve your fellow man first. What does that tell you? It tells you, forget about all this intellectual, yeah, I love God and this and that. If you're gonna, forget about talking the talk, walk the walk. You want to serve God, serve people. What more noble way to serve people than to risk your own life to save them?
September 11th has changed the whole world, and it has also put the Muslim community in the spotlight.
How about the dove installation?
Muslims have a lot of hostility being hurled at them. But this is also a time of transformation. Many people are very eager to understand Islam and want to know who is the Prophet, what is the Quran, who are the Muslims, how do they live?
Through the stories about Prophet Muhammad, we were able to make connections, and all of a sudden you would feel that you could relate to things that happened 1,500 years ago, and that the issues weren't old-fashioned. They were universal. And that's what he's taught me.
Ovo je priča koju muslimani već 1400 godina prenose s generacije na generaciju. Priča o trgovcu, suprugu, ocu, državniku i ratniku, kojeg oni smatraju posljednjim Božjim poslanikom, čovjekom čije nasljeđe određuje njihove živote i danas. Muhammed, nasljeđe poslanika.
The life of Muhammad is, even in its details, probably better known than any other major religious figure before modern times. His followers made careful efforts to record memories that they had of things that he had said and things that he had done. Many of these traditions may have been made up later on, but at the core, there seems to me to be little reason to doubt that there is a picture and a portrait of a living man.
Sudeći prema izvorima muslimana, Muhammed bin Abdullah ili sin Abdullahov rođen je 570. godine u Meki, u dijelu svijeta koji danas nazivamo Saudijskom Arabijom. Jedan tadašnji pjesnik Meku je opisao kao mjesto u kojem su ljeto i zima podjednako nesnošljivi. Svijet u koji je Muhammed stigao bio je brutalan. Vladali su glad, nasilje i plemenski ratovi.
You could not exist without your tribe. An individual in this dangerous world had absolutely no chance of survival. And that meant that the tribe had become perhaps the most sacred value in Arabia.
It's a society that's based on the idea of vigilantism, that if somebody attacked my clan, then I have a right to go and attack anyone from his clan. They saw justice as taking revenge.
Arapi u 6. stoljeću nisu imali pisani zakon, zajedničku religiju i niti centralnu vladu. U ovom opasnom svijetu, Muhammed je imao sreću što je pripadao moćnom plemenu Kurejš. Njegov je otac umro prije njegovog rođenja. Majka mu je umrla kad mu je bilo samo 6 godina. Malo siroče odgojio je njegov amidža Abu Talib.
He surely had to have worried about his future, what will he be? And so he must have been a very introspective child. Muhammad had the habit of going out in the desert and contemplating the stars and thinking about why he was an orphan and how would life be to him in the future.
Orphans were marginal people, and he felt very, very strongly identified with the poor and disadvantaged for the rest of his life.
Meka Muhammedove mladosti bila je i religijski i financijski centar. Nalazila se na raskršću dva glavna trgovačka puta. Hodočasnici su dolazili iz svih dijelova zemlje kako bi obožavali stotine idola koji su okruživali Kabu, stari hram u srcu grada. Kaba je okružena svetim područjem u kojem nije dozvoljeno ratovanje. Ono što bi hodočasnici donosili omogućavalo je ljudima poput Muhammeda da prežive, prodajući na pijacama Meke. Muhammed je uskoro počeo raditi kao agent za bogate trgovce. Prevozio je njihovu robu na karavanima širom Arabije. Na ovim putovanjima susretao se s brojnim plemenima i zajednicama i velikim brojem novih ideja.
He probably learned the differences that exist between different tribes, people speaking different languages. He encountered Christians and Jews and learned from them what their faith, what their religion, what their cultures are.
Muhammad would have become aware that for the Jews and the Christians, the Holy Scripture was very important. Both got scriptures in which God had sent a sacred message to prophets. And this was a way in which people could relate to the divine. When Muhammad was about 25 years old, he had a major change in his life. A wealthy widow, older woman named Khadija, asked him to take her caravans into Syria for her.
Muhammad took all her goods and went with the caravan to Syria and did an incredible job. And her respect for him turned into admiration for him, and she inquired about him through one of her friends.
Shortly thereafter,
Uskoro je Khadija pitala Muhameda da je uzme za ženu. Sviđaš mi se zbog našeg odnosa, rekla je, i ugleda koji uživaš među svojim narodom, zbog tvoje pouzdanosti, dobre naravi i istinoljublja.
And this is interesting because she's a very beautiful woman, but she's 40. She's moving into her maturity, and he's a 25-year-old youth. He's an orphan, and he accepts this proposal, and it's arranged through the family, and he does indeed marry her.
And people have often said rather sneeringly that this was just a marriage of convenience on his part. He just married the wealthy widow for his own gain and profit. But there's no doubt in my mind that he deeply, deeply loved Khadija.
Over the course of their marriage,
Khadija i Muhammed imali su 4 kćerke i 2 sina, koja su umrla u ranoj mladosti. Muhammed je bio porodičan čovjek i ugledan trgovac. Ali kako se bližio njegov 40. rođendan, Muhammed je postajao sve nemirniji i zabrinutiji za problematično mekansko društvo.
Within a few generations, they had gone from this kind of brutal existence in the Arabian steppes to becoming financiers, bankers, businessmen, merchants with a lot of money. And this was great, of course, and people were delighted, but it was a very disturbing time because the market economy demanded, as we know only too well in the West, a strong competitive streak. People no longer felt that they had to take care of the poor and the needy and the weaker members of Quraysh any longer. They had to make as much money as they possibly could.
They had a marvelous society, they had a trading town, they were booming, they were doing business, they were living like an affluent society. And when you have an affluent society, the tendency is to become hedonistic, to look at, what are the pleasures of life?
Muhammed se često povlačio u planine u blizini Meke, gdje je meditirao. Na jednom takvom odlasku u planine 610. godine, Muhammed je iskusio nešto što će promijeniti historiju.
The prophet used to retire from time to time into a hill called Jabal an-Nur, the mountain of light. When you climb up that mountain, and many people still do it, on top of it is a cave called Al-Hira in Arabic, into which the Prophet would oftentimes retire in order to contemplate and to pray and to be still with God. The coming of the revelation
Dolazak objave desio se odjednom. Objava s neba stigla je iznenada.
Muhammad was woken from sleep and felt himself absolutely enveloped by a terrifying divine presence. He says it's an angel that seemed to squeeze him in a devastating embrace, and it felt as though all the breath was being squeezed out of his body, and a voice said to him, "Recite." And Muhammad said, "No, I am not a reciter." The voice again said, "Recite. Recite." And then squeezed, as he said, almost beyond his endurance, Muhammad felt the first inspired words of a new scripture in Arabic pouring from his lips.
اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق. That is, recite in the name of thy Lord who created.
And Islam had come into being.
And the Prophet, of course, having received the divine word, began to tremble and in tremendous fear, because there's no common ground between the human reality and the divine reality. He ran out of the cave. When he ran out of the cave, he looked back, and the archangel filled up the whole of the sky.
Everywhere you looked, there was Gabriel. Not just a single angelic image, but a presence, a being, a power. This is how the ineffable, incomprehensible, utterly transcendent, indescribable God makes itself known to us.
This was something that really shook him to the very core of his being. And he goes down from that mountain and he is shaking. And I think it's shock. Here's somebody who's gone looking for this transcendent reality, and this transcendent reality is now replying.
Muhammad
alejhi selama, ovo iskustvo toliko je potreslo da se plašio da nije opsjednut. Otrčao je kući pravo svojoj Hatidži.
And there he flung himself into her lap, and he said, cover me, hold me, until the terror had passed. Khadija was the person who reassured him. He said, have I become a kahin, a soothsayer? And she said, no, my dear, this is not what God does. This revelation comes from God.
The message Muhammad received on the mountain of light was simple. He was to recite the words of the one true God. But Muhammad still had doubts that his experience was genuine.
Khadija thought it would be a good idea to go to consult her cousin, Waraka, who was a Christian.
She's saying, we need to go to somebody that knows about these things. Because if you're told you're being given a message from God, well, there have been previous messages. So let's go ask Waraka, who knows the scripture. He knows the Torah and the gospel.
And as soon as Waraka heard about this, he immediately said, Muhammad is the prophet who will bring the revelation of the one God to the Arabs. And he warned Muhammad that he would have a really rough time.
He says, your people are going to reject you and they will chase you out of this city. This has never come to any human being except they were persecuted, because this is basically undermining the paradigm.
And after a while, Muhammad began to realize that the messages he was receiving fit a pattern that he knew about from Jewish and Christian tradition as well, and that is that there are such things as prophets. There are people who receive messages from the divine, and that he began to realize that indeed he was one of them as well.
When we think of prophecy, we come from a tradition in America where we think of Charlton Heston, you know, with a great big beard, and the wind's always blowing, and he's wearing raggedy clothes, and they're ranting people, you know, they're ranting, raving. In the Islamic view, a prophet isn't this kind of person at all, but it's a person who has been selected very reluctantly from his people. God selected them, and they couldn't get out of the clutches in the sense they had to do it.
You have to think in terms of a tribal Bedouin society. What is the worst thing that could happen to somebody? It is not death. It is shame. And so I'm sure that in his own mind, the idea of being shamed was probably very important. And think of the double loss of face. You know, he's going to lose face, he's going to be shamed in front of his people, and he's going to be shamed in front of Allah who gave him that message.
One of the drawing features to me as a non-Muslim who came from just a very diverse background was his humility and his humanness.
Kevin James
je nadzornik u vatrogasnoj službi u Brooklynu u New Yorku koji se još kao mladić vratio islamu.
I felt a kinship to him also personally. And there's probably about 1 billion Muslims who would say the same thing personal, this personal kinship that they feel with him. He grew up an orphan. Now, I'm not an orphan. I have 2 parents, but my position in society, I've always felt separate. America is a racial nation, and either you're black, you're white, you're Italian, you're Jewish, you're this and that. So coming from a mixed background, I felt like kind of in limbo. My father is Native American and African American, and my mother is Jewish. They were very a-religious, I would say, to the point of being atheists or agnostic. I recall as a child, we get a dreidel on Hanukkah, that we had a menorah in the house, and we also had a Christmas tree and exchanged presents. So I just never really identified with any religion. But what was always emphasized was discussion and dialogue and seeking for the truth. So I went through a period of trial and error searching, and I stumbled, I guess I almost literally stumbled on Islam. What appealed to me was the universality of the message. Any religion that gives a code of righteous, ethical conduct and respect and gratitude and obedience to one being is Islam. So here is a book, the Holy Quran, that validates other religions, the diversity of mankind, and it puts the onus of salvation on the believer. The Quran teaches you that the saving of one life is as if you saved all of humanity. And that's one of the reasons why I became a firefighter. What more noble calling than that, to save a person's life, to save people, to save their property?
There's another fire in the back. There's been a couple of fires.
Okay, yeah, so show me what you have. From being a firefighter, I became a fire marshal. That's an arson investigator.
How long has this been vacant?
That's another form of prevention, of saving lives. Well, I guess there's no doubt what caused this. A firefighter, he'll risk his life to save you, whether you're black, brown, red, Jew, Muslim, Christian, atheist. He's not asking you what your philosophy is or looking at your color. He's looking to get you out of the building.
Y'all is from Brooklyn.
That's why many people say that firefighting is a calling, because of that self-sacrifice, the willingness to just put others before yourself. To be a good Muslim, you serve people. And specifically, Prophet Muhammad, he asked the question to people around him, do you love your Creator? Serve your fellow man first.
U poruci koju je Muhammed a.s. primio od Boga, govori se da će njegov narod u sljedećem životu odgovarati za svoje ponašanje u ovom životu. Iako je Muhammed a.s. isprva oklijevao da drugima priča o svom iskustvu, u novom otkrovenju naređeno mu je da obznani poruku.
So he calls all of his family members together and he says, what would you say if I told you that there was this army waiting to attack us on the other side of that hill? They said, we would believe you. And he said, what would you say if I told you I'm a messenger from God? You think it's absurd. You called us together for this? And he says, will no one support me in this? And the only person is a child, Ali, who's his cousin, gets up and says, I will support you. And they think this is hilarious, that this is who's going to follow this prophet is a child.
Think about it. There's a man, a middle-aged man, who doesn't know how to read or write, who has no wealth, who is an orphan. Yes, he is from a very important tribe, but he works for a woman. And he now says, I'm the prophet. God has spoken to me. This is not going to fly.
Božanska poruka koju je Muhammed donio svojim sugrađanima sadržavala je strogo upozorenje društvu koje se sve više okretalo ka materijalnom.
He was coming to warn the people of Mecca and the surrounding countryside and his own tribe of Quraysh that unless they pulled themselves together and started creating a more just and decent society, restoring the old tribal values of looking after the poor, the orphan, the widow, the oppressed, then there was going to be a terrible catastrophe.
The Arabs did not believe in afterlife. They really thought that life ended with death, and there was no resurrection, there was no coming back, there was no reincarnation.
So now Muhammad is saying, you know that one God we spoke of? When you're going to die, you don't just disappear, but you're going to be accountable to that God for the good deeds and the bad deeds.
He was bringing a moral, ethical, social message to his people that we're all in the same boat before God and we must treat each other well with compassion and justice and equity.
Poruka koju je Muhammed primio na planini svjetlosti bila je prva od brojnih koje će primati do kraja života.
The revelation does not come in a lump sum. It doesn't just come down from heaven, here's the book, now go out and teach it to the people. No. It is coming down slowly. It's coming down as events unfold. And it's explaining the events, but it's also coming down in a way that he can absorb it. Because the idea is that this thing is so tremendous, this thing is so immense, that it's not something that we can give you all at once. This is going to take time.
He used to say that I never once experienced a revelation without feeling that my soul had been torn from my body.
The prophet could be sitting, he could be on horseback, he could be walking, he could be talking, but he was suddenly seized by the divine word.
He would feel a great weight descend upon him. He would sweat profusely, even on a cold day. Sometimes, he said, it would be like the reverberations of a bell, and that, he said, is hardest for me. It's not the words that were coming, but he'd have to listen very hard for the meaning of what communication, divine communication, was coming through.
Nakon prijema svake objave, Muhammed alejhi selam bi je prenio ljudima koji su bili s njim, a oni bi je prenosili zajednici.
When the prophet, who did not know how to read and write, started revealing the words of the Quran, they acquired credibility because of the very nature of the words spoken. People would look at it and say, my goodness, this cannot be the words of a man. He could not have made this up.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون واعتصموا بحبل الله جميعا ولا تفرقوا واذكروا نعمة الله عليكم.
The Quran is the most extraordinarily beautiful discourse. It doesn't come over in translation, but the Arabic is extraordinary. When the first Muslims heard the Quran, many of them were converted to the Prophet's message, not necessarily because of its content, but because of its beauty.
That revelation was presented in a society where there were people who were professional memorizers. They could hear something recited once and they could repeat it. The recitation then by Muhammad was carefully preserved immediately in the minds of memorizers and in the minds of people who were able to write down notes, what we now call